The bitter Wyoming winter of 1872 had claimed 12 lives already, but Jonathan Miles noticed only the silence. His cabin stood alone against the white hills, a small shape in a sea of snow. He had chosen this isolation 3 years ago, trading the noise of towns and men for the company of wind and cattle. That morning, the smoke from his chimney rose straight into the sky. No wind, no sound, no sign of life but his own breath. He found the tracks just before noon. Small impressions in the fresh snow, leading in circles that made no sense. Too small for a deer, too careful for a fox. They spoke of confusion, of someone walking without purpose, perhaps on the edge of giving up. He followed them, crouching low to study the marks, and saw what he feared, a human trail the size of a child's. The girl couldn't have been more than 11. She was huddled against a fallen pine, her deerskin clothes stiff with frost, her dark eyes half closed in exhaustion. Her moccasins had left that trail of circles he'd been following. Jonathan stopped a few feet away, afraid that if he spoke too loudly, she might vanish like a ghost. Her eyes fluttered open. For a moment, fear flashed in them, and she shrank against the tree. He saw the fine beadwork on her sleeves and knew what that meant. Shoshone. She belonged to the people whose lands stretched beyond the eastern ridge. To take her home meant crossing into territory where white men were not welcome, where warnings were not spoken twice. He remembered Colonel Greeley's words from Red Bluff. Cross into their land, you're dead. Bring one of them into yours, you're worse than dead. But Jonathan couldn't walk away. The child's trembling hands told a truth stronger than any warning. He took off his heavy wool coat and set it down in the snow between them. You need this, he said softly. She hesitated, staring at him as if he were a wild animal. Then, slowly, she reached for it and wrapped it around her small frame. The coat swallowed her whole, but she clutched it tight. Jonathan stood there, unsure what came next. He knew the Shoshone by reputation. Skilled warriors, silent hunters, people who never forgot trespasses. But this was no trespass born of greed. It was a rescue. He reached into his pack and pulled out a strip of dried venison, offering it without a word. She took it quickly, eyes darting to the trees, as if she expected someone to appear. I can take you home, he said, pointing toward the ridge. He mimed walking, then gestured to her and back toward the mountains. She watched him carefully, her face expressionless, then gave the smallest nod. Jonathan turned and began walking east, breaking a trail through the deep snow. Behind him, he heard her follow, her steps light and careful, her small body wrapped in his oversized coat. The snow reached his knees in places, but he pushed on, each step crunching under the heavy silence of the forest. He'd been a quiet man long before he came to Wyoming. His cabin, his cattle, his books, these were enough. The townsfolk called him the Ghost, saying he preferred the company of snow and timber to people. Maybe they were right. But as he heard the soft sound of her footsteps behind him, something inside him stirred that he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. The hours passed, the sky turning a dull gray as the light began to fade. The wind picked up, whispering through the trees. When the girl stumbled and fell to her knees, Jonathan turned and offered his hand. She didn't take it. Her pride was stronger than her strength. So he turned his back to her, kneeling slightly. Climb on, he said. For a long moment she didn't move. Then her small hands touched his shoulders and she climbed onto his back. Her weight was light, barely there. He could feel her shivering, her breath brushing against his neck. He started walking again, the snow crunching beneath his boots. The ridge was still a mile away when he first felt it, the sense of being watched. He stopped, eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. But the silence had changed. The forest was holding its breath. Even the ravens had gone quiet. He knew that kind of silence. It meant eyes were on him. Just returning the child, he said aloud to the trees, his voice steady. No answer came, but the tension eased, and he kept moving. They reached the ridge at sunset. From there, Jonathan saw smoke rising from the valley below, thin gray lines curling from the lodges of a Shoshone camp. The girl stirred on his back, her breath quickening. She whispered something in her own tongue, excitement trembling in her voice. He set her down beside a fallen log and crouched with her to watch the camp. It was peaceful, 30 or so lodges, smoke curling into the dimming sky. The sight brought a smile to her face, the first he'd seen. Before he could stop her, she stood and shouted, a clear, ringing cry that carried across the valley. Heads turned below. Warriors emerged from lodges, hands reaching for bows. Jonathan froze, his heart pounding as 3 riders broke away and galloped toward them. He stood tall, hands raised in peace as the horses came closer. The girl shouted again, waving her arms. The riders slowed but didn't lower their guard. Their faces were hard, eyes sharp and watchful. One of them, a man with an eagle feather in his hair, spoke to the girl in their language. She answered quickly, pointing to Jonathan, then to the forest behind them. The warrior's eyes narrowed but softened as he listened. When she finished, Jonathan bent to pick up his coat where she had dropped it. He held it out toward the warrior, a gesture of goodwill, the only language that mattered. The warrior didn't take it. Instead, he pointed toward the camp below. Jonathan understood. They wanted him to come. As the sun vanished behind the hills, Jonathan Miles followed the Shoshone riders down into the valley, unaware that this single act of kindness would soon bring 300 warriors to his door. The air grew colder as Jonathan Miles followed the 3 mounted warriors into the Shoshone Valley. The light of sunset burned through the pine trees, turning the snow pink and gold, and every sound, the crunch of hooves, the creak of saddles, echoed with strange clarity in the frozen stillness. He walked between the riders, their horses taller than him, their eyes hidden under the shadow of painted faces. Ahead, the girl, Tala, rode on the lead warrior's horse, wrapped in his blanket, her small hands gripping the saddle. She kept looking back at Jonathan, her eyes full of something between pride and worry. The camp came into full view at the bottom of the slope. Dozens of hide lodges arranged in a wide circle, smoke rising from each one. Women stopped their work, children froze mid-play, and dogs barked until silenced by sharp whistles. All eyes turned toward the strange sight, a white man walking behind Shoshone warriors. Jonathan's boots sank deep into the snow as they entered the clearing. He felt the weight of every stare, but he kept his head level and his hands visible. The riders stopped near the center of the camp. Tala slid off the horse and ran toward a tall man emerging from the largest lodge. The man's presence silenced even the dogs. He was the chief, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a cloak of fur and beads that shimmered in the firelight. His eyes, dark and calm, took in the scene before him. Tala reached him, throwing her arms around his waist. The chief bent, examining her face, her hands, her feet. When he was sure she was unharmed, he looked up at Jonathan. No anger, no welcome, just quiet study. The warrior who had led them into camp spoke quickly, his words sharp and precise. Jonathan didn't need to understand the language to know what was being said. He had crossed the line. He had entered their world. The girl interrupted, talking fast, her voice trembling but sure. She pointed to Jonathan again and again, her small hands cutting the cold air. The chief's gaze never left Jonathan's face. When she finished, the chief stepped forward. "Tala," he said, placing a hand over his chest, then pointing to her. "My daughter." Jonathan nodded. She was lost. Cold was coming. "I brought her home." The chief's eyes softened, just slightly. He turned to one of the men nearby and said something brief. The warrior disappeared into a lodge, returning moments later with a folded buffalo robe. The chief took it and held it out to Jonathan. Jonathan hesitated. It was not a gift to refuse. Not here. He accepted it with both hands. "Thank you," he said quietly. The chief nodded once, then gestured toward the mountains. "Night comes. You stay," he said, his English heavy but clear. Jonathan shook his head. "My cabin's near. I'll manage." The chief seemed to understand. He didn't press. Instead, he touched the buffalo robe once more, as if sealing the exchange. Then he turned away, guiding Tala and her mother toward their lodge. Jonathan stood alone in the center of the camp for a long moment, surrounded by men who said nothing but watched everything. Then, slowly, the circle opened for him. The same 3 riders who had brought him escorted him partway up the ridge. When they stopped, one of them spoke softly and gestured toward the stars. Jonathan nodded, understanding their meaning. Safe passage home. He walked through the night, wrapped in the robe. The snow gleamed faintly under the moonlight, and the only sound was his boots breaking the crusted surface. It was long past midnight when he saw the dark outline of his cabin through the trees. He reached his porch, went inside, and dropped the robe over a chair. The fire was cold, but exhaustion pressed him down before he could relight it. He fell asleep, still wearing his boots. When he woke, the gray dawn had already filled the sky. The fire crackled again, and his small cabin smelled of coffee and wood smoke. For a while, it felt like any other morning. He poured himself a cup and stood by the window, watching the snow drift lazily down. But then came the feeling. The one every hunter knows, the prickle at the back of the neck when something unseen watches from the trees. Jonathan froze, the cup halfway to his lips. He set it down, walked quietly to the door, and opened it. At first, there was only snow. Then a shape moved among the pines, a horse. Then another. Then another. He stepped outside, his boots crunching on the icy ground. The sound was faint, but growing. Hooves striking hard earth, hundreds of them. From the forest's edge, riders began to appear. 1 by 1, 2 by 2. Then in long, perfect lines, they came like a slow-moving river of color and silence. Faces painted, feathers glinting in the pale morning light, horses adorned with beads and blankets that shone against the snow. 10 riders, 20, 50, 100. By the time Jonathan realized the size of what he was seeing, the line of riders stretched across the entire clearing. 300 Shoshone warriors stood before his cabin, still as stone, their breath rising in white clouds. Jonathan didn't move. He could hear his own heartbeat, louder than the wind. No weapons were drawn. No voices called out. Just a silence so heavy it pressed against his chest. Then the line parted. The chief rode forward, wearing the same fur cloak, the same calm expression. Beside him, on a smaller pony, rode Tala. Jonathan's throat tightened. He stepped down from his porch, the snow crunching beneath his feet. The chief dismounted, handing his reins to a younger warrior. Tala remained seated, watching with proud eyes. The chief crossed the clearing alone, his moccasins sinking softly into the snow. Around his neck hung a necklace of bear claws and turquoise stones. In his hands, he carried a bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. He stopped an arm's length from Jonathan. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence was complete. Then the chief extended the bundle. Jonathan accepted it with both hands. Slowly, he unwrapped the leather covering. Inside lay a bow unlike any he had ever seen, carved from mountain ash, polished smooth, inlaid with bone and shell that shimmered in the morning light. It was a masterpiece. The chief placed his hand on his chest and spoke in English, his voice deep and even. "A father's debt," he said. "My people remember those who show courage and kindness when there is nothing to gain." Jonathan swallowed hard, unsure what to say. Before he could answer, the chief turned slightly and raised his hand. 300 warriors struck their chests with their right hands in perfect unison. The sound echoed across the valley like thunder rolling over the mountains. Then, without another word, the chief turned and walked back to his horse. Jonathan stood alone in the clearing, the bow in his hands, as the army of riders wheeled as one and disappeared silently back into the trees. The only evidence they had ever been there was the trampled snow and the sound that still rang faintly in his ears. 300 hearts honoring one man's kindness. The days that followed were quiet again. But the silence had changed. It was no longer the loneliness that had filled Jonathan's cabin before, but something heavier, deeper, as if the world itself remembered what had happened there. The ceremonial bow now hung above his fireplace, its carved surface gleaming softly in the firelight. He hadn't touched it since that morning. It felt too sacred, too full of meaning he could never quite name. Every time he looked at it, he remembered the sound of 300 fists striking 300 chests, echoing across the snow like the heartbeat of the mountains. Word spread fast through the Wyoming settlements. Travelers spoke of the gathering at the Miles homestead, 300 Shoshone warriors standing silent before a white rancher's cabin. Some said it was a warning. Others called it a miracle. No one truly knew what had passed between Jonathan and the chief, but everyone agreed on one thing. The man who had once been called the Ghost was no longer just another lonely rancher. By the time the first thaw came, Colonel Greeley himself rode up from Fort Bridger, his uniform dusted with melting snow. He dismounted stiffly, his boots crunching across the clearing. Jonathan met him at the porch with his usual calm. "Morning, Colonel," he said, holding out a mug of coffee. Greeley took it but didn't drink. His sharp eyes swept the yard, then lifted to the bow above the hearth. "I've heard things, Miles," he said at last. "Stories. Half the valley's been buzzing. You want to tell me what really happened?" Jonathan stirred the fire with the poker, watching the flames leap. "A child was lost," he said simply. "I found her and brought her home." Greeley frowned. "And 300 armed warriors appeared here the next morning to thank you? That's what you're telling me?" "That's what happened." The colonel studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Whatever it was, it kept the peace. The patrols haven't reported a single skirmish in weeks. Maybe you did something right out there." Jonathan only shrugged. "I didn't do anything any man shouldn't have done." Greeley set his cup down on the porch railing. "You did something most wouldn't have had the guts for. Maybe that's why they remembered." He tipped his hat. "If the army had 300 men with that kind of memory, maybe we'd have peace already." Jonathan smiled faintly. "Maybe peace doesn't come from remembering battles, Colonel. Maybe it comes from remembering kindness." The colonel said nothing more. He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving only the sound of hooves fading into the distance. That night, Jonathan sat by the fire, the cabin warm and still. Outside, the wind carried the faint cries of wolves, but even that felt softer somehow. He took down the bow from its place above the fireplace, turning it carefully in his hands. The craftsmanship told a story older than his own, of fathers teaching sons, of hands that shaped the wood not for war, but for meaning. He ran his fingers along the inlaid design, tracing the symbols carved into its surface: waves, feathers, and a rising sun. He didn't know their language, but he understood what they stood for: life, strength, renewal. Spring arrived early that year. The snow melted from the hills, revealing soft green grass beneath. The creek beside his cabin began to sing again, its frozen voice breaking free. With the thaw came travelers, trappers, traders, and a few settlers passing through on their way north. Many stopped at Jonathan's homestead, asking about the stories they'd heard. Some came out of curiosity, others out of disbelief. All left quieter than they'd arrived. They looked at the bow, at the man who'd earned it, and somehow felt they were in the presence of something sacred. One afternoon, a young woman from Red Bluff rode up with supplies. "Mr. Miles," she said shyly as he helped her unload the wagon, "is it true about the warriors?" Jonathan smiled, his eyes soft. "Depends which part you've heard. They say they stood right here, 300 of them, not a word spoken." He nodded. "That part's true." "And you weren't afraid?" Jonathan looked past her, toward the distant line of trees where the snow still clung to the shadows. "I was," he admitted. "But fear doesn't always mean you're in danger. Sometimes it means you're standing in the middle of something bigger than yourself." The woman looked up at the bow hanging through the open cabin door. "And they gave you that?" "They gave me their thanks," he said quietly. "The bow's just how they said it." After she left, Jonathan stood outside, watching the sunset stretch across the hills. The world felt wider than it had before, but somehow closer too. Somewhere beyond those ridges, the Shoshone tribe moved through their valley, their fires burning beneath the same sky. He wondered if Tala remembered him, the little girl with the frost in her hair and the courage in her eyes. He hoped she did. Because he remembered her. not just as a child he'd saved, but as the moment that had changed his life. As the first stars appeared, Jonathan laid a hand on the bow one last time before turning in. The mountains outside stood silent, patient, eternal. He knew he would never see the chief again, but that didn't matter. The message had already been delivered, between two worlds that didn't need the same words to understand each other. And when the wind swept down from the white hills, rustling the pines around his cabin, Jonathan sometimes thought he could still hear it. The distant rhythm of 300 hearts beating in unison. A sound of honor, a sound of peace,